Grab your favorite beverage. It's time for the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what's up? It is week 12. We got 7 AFC home games to get into, including the Thursday night game, Indianapolis at Houston. We're going to see who's got the good matchups, who's trending up, who's trending down. We're in the home stretch here, only 1 or 2 more games left in the regular season, and I'm hopefully going to help all of you guys lock up a playoff spot and hopefully win some fantasy football championships. So let's get into it. We got the Colts at the Texans. Thursday night. It is a 45.5 point over-under right now. Colts are getting 3.5 points on the road. The Colts definitely wanted to focus on running the ball last week with Marlon Mack. He was on pace to have 25 carries before he left the game with a broken hand, which he just had surgery on yesterday, I believe. He left in the middle of the third quarter. Jonathan Williams came in, had 10 carries after Marlon Mack went down. 7 of them in the fourth quarter. Both RBs had over 100 rushing yards. Both of them averaged over 7.5 yards per carry. They looked awesome. I think Marlon Mack is projected to miss a few games with that broken hand. So Jonathan Williams should be a solid start on a team that definitely wants to run the ball this week. A lot is made of the first 15 plays that teams run, and you look at the first 15 for the Colts last week. 7 of them were Marlon Mack runs. One of them was that touchdown run capping off the second drive. With this awesome offensive line and a QB that's dealing with some knee and ankle issues, I think they're going to try and run the hell out of the ball. Also, I think Nyheim Hines isn't the worst play. The Texans allow the most receptions and the second most receiving yards to running backs. Like I said, with Marlon Mack out, I think the 20 touches a game that Mack was averaging, you got to figure a handful of those will become Nyheim Hines targets. So should be a pretty good FanDuel play for him as well this week. I'm sure he's not all that expensive, and he should get some work. Plus, with all the injuries to T.Y. Hilton and Paris Campbell, apparently T.Y.'s trending in the right direction. He might actually have a chance to play in this game. I think the Colts, again, are going to really try and focus on running the ball. For the Texans, you got Watson, who went down in the fourth quarter with an ankle injury, I think it was. The Texans were getting beat up pretty good. They were forced to get away from the run game. So we'll see how Watson is going into this Thursday night game. If there's no Watson, I think the Texans are going to have to try and rely on their run game a little bit more. The Ravens defense did a great job holding Watson to 4 fantasy points, which is kind of crazy to say, but that's what they did. Watson and Holmes, they kind of got screwed on that touchdown. That was there was a non-call pass interference in the end zone. It was a horrible call. I think it was blatantly obvious he was being held. 2/3 of the team targets went to DeAndre Hopkins and Kenny Stills, who only caught 11 of those 20 targets. So it was definitely a subpar game for the pass game as a whole. The running backs did well. They had over 100 yards and a touchdown on 15 carries between the two of them. They just couldn't really run the ball because the Texans were getting beat so bad, falling behind by 14 points at the halftime. So they didn't really have as much opportunity. And the wide receivers were getting the targets, and they weren't really doing much with them. So it was definitely kind of a sloppy game. I think the Texans hopefully can get back on track. This Colts team that they're tough on running backs, but they're not really doing anything great. They have been playing better as of late, but we'll see how they do in this division matchup. We got another AFC South division game. The Jags at the Titans. Jags getting 3 points on the road, 41.5 point over-under right now. So Nick Foles made his return. He finished fourth in the league last week in air yards. He was throwing it all over the place. He targeted 8 different Jaguars. DJ Shark was the most frequently targeted guy, 15 targets, most he's seen all season. Foles threw 20 passes in the first half, and they only ran the ball 6 times. That's a horrible run-to-pass ratio. All 14 of Foles' short passes were completed, but all 6 of his deep passes were incomplete. So his deep accuracy is just not there, which you would assume, after he hasn't played in 10 weeks. But let's see here. Yeah, he attempted 11 deep passes altogether, and only 3 of them were caught. So, and one of them was negated by a pass interference or a holding call, I think it was. But and the other 2 were on the final drive, so it didn't really happen for them until the end of the game. Maybe they can carry that over into the next game. But I get taking deep shots once you establish the run and whatnot, but when you only give your running back 8 carries, I don't know how you can establish the run to take these deep shots. It just seemed really sloppy to me. John DeFilippo, the offensive coordinator, he was fired by the Vikings for not running the ball enough, and I hope this was an outlier and not something to, not some kind of new offensive approach now that Foles is back. We saw them; they were much more balanced with Gardner Minshew, and the offense looked a hell of a lot better than they did last week. It was just a lot of dink and dunks and then deep shots that just weren't connecting. So Fournette did have 15 touches, but 8 carries for him is not enough. These 2 teams here, the Jags and the Titans, 2 super frustrating teams with their massive running backs. It seems like they're always kind of screwing these guys out of the touches that they deserve. I think Chris Conley has kind of taken over the wide receiver 2 spot from D.D. Westbrook. Conley and DJ Shark, 95% snap counts to D.D. Westbrook's 84%. So D.D. was definitely the 3rd wide receiver in Week 11. He only saw 6 targets to Conley's 8. And actually, if you look back at their Week 1 game, I know it was only 1 quarter that Foles played, but he connected on deep passes to Conley and DJ Shark. And he didn't target Westbrook once out of the, I think it was 8 or 9 passes that he attempted before he got hurt. So definitely seems like he's developing something with Chris Conley, and DJ Shark has been the most reliable receiver for them all year, so that doesn't surprise me. So like I said, these running backs on these 2 teams, Derrick Henry ran wild on the Chiefs in Week 10. The Titans are coming off of their bye. He had 188 rushing yards on 23 attempts in that game. He had 61 yards before contact, which is crazy. That just says that the Titans' offensive line was pretty much just blowing the Chiefs' defensive line off the line of scrimmage. The Jags are actually allowing the 8th most fantasy points to running backs right now. They just allowed 2 different Colt running backs to rush for over 100 yards, so I expect the Titans, coming off of a bye, to run the ball early and often with Derrick Henry. Jonnu Smith and Anthony Firkser accounted for half the team's target share in Week 10 and a third of Tannehill's passing yards and one of the 2 passing touchdowns that he had. So I don't think that will happen again. I think it was a matchup situation with the Chiefs allowing the 3rd most receptions and receiving yards to tight ends. It was probably, the Jags just looking at that, or the Titans just looking at that and saying, let's get these tight ends involved. The Jags, on the other hand, are in the bottom 8 as far as catches and yards allowed to tight ends. So I expect A.J. Brown and Tajay Sharp and Corey Davis to get a little bit more involved. Still, I'm only going to play Derrick Henry in this game. I don't think anybody else is consistent enough to warrant playing in a week that is this important. It's Week 12. All right. Another division game, AFC North. We got the Steelers playing the Bengals. Bengals still looking for their first win. The Steelers are minus 6.5 and the over-under is set to 39 right now. And actually the home team, which is the Bengals, their over-under, individual team over-under is 16 points, which I'm considering taking this week. Looking at the home team, the Bengals, so Mixon with 3 straight 15-plus fantasy point games now. So strange that 2 of Mixon's 3 best games this year came with Ryan Finley at quarterback and not Andy Dalton. The weakness of the Steelers' defense is definitely defending the tight ends, and we saw Tyler Eifert and C.J. Uzomah get a third of Finley's targets last week. Auden Tate's the only wide receiver who had any receiving yards last week for the Bengals, and he's in concussion protocol right now, so I think Mixon and maybe these tight ends, if you're really in a pinch, are really the only good starts on this team with Ryan Finley at quarterback. They took it to the Raiders down to the wire, but they just couldn't get that win. The Steelers, on the other hand, so the Steelers were hit with 3 key injuries during last Thursday's game against the Browns. Juju and Deontay Johnson, the team's 2 leading wide receivers on the year, both left with concussions, plus Juju's dealing with a knee injury, I think it is. James Conner also left the game. The shoulder injury that kept him out of weeks 9 and 10 flared up again and caused him to miss the rest of the game. The extra 3 days off here should help, but you never know with concussions. Plus, Juju, who, concussion and a knee injury, he's just been so inconsistent. This team's really struggling, man. I don't really like anybody except for maybe Jalen Samuels if James Conner doesn't play, and Vance McDonald, actually. So with Juju and Deontay Johnson leaving the games, Vance McDonald was tied with Johnny Holton, whoever the hell that is, for the team leader in targets. If these 2 wide receivers miss the game versus the Bengals, I think Vance McDonald becomes a must-play just solely because of the volume that you got to figure he's going to see, and would probably be a great FanDuel play as well. So I'd keep my eye on for these tight ends in this matchup. There's actually a bunch of tight ends this week that have good matchup and that are in good situations. All right, moving on to the Broncos at the Bills. Broncos getting 4 points on the road, 37.5 point over-under right now. The away team over-under 16.5, another interesting one there on the FanDuel Sportsbook. The Broncos tried to attack the Vikings defense deep on 5 of their first 12 passes last week, including Courtland Sutton's 38-yard pass to Tim Patrick. The Broncos jumped out to a 20-0 lead going into the half, and they were outscored 27-3 in the second half. That kind of sucks. Brandon Allen attempted 22 of his 39 passes in the second half to only 12 rush attempts, so they just got completely away from the running game. Allen completed less than half of his passes. His only touchdown went to Troy Fumagalli, if I'm saying it right, backup tight end. 72% of his passes went to Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, and Noah Fant. So it seems like those are the 3 guys that are really going to the offense is going to go through. And the quarterback change seemingly won't hurt the target share of Courtland Sutton, who finished with 5 catches on 9 targets for 113 yards. And like I said, he had that 40-yard deep pass that he threw. It's not really it's the quarterback's accuracy that is my concern. Noah Fant only caught 4 of his 11 targets because Brandon Allen just wasn't all that accurate with the ball. The quarterback change has negatively affected the target share of the Broncos running backs, actually, especially Royce Freeman, who's kind of needs those 4 or 5 targets a game to keep his floor up. I think Freeman is a sit until we see him get more than 9 touches a game. That they were up at 20 points at halftime. That should be Freeman time. He's the bigger running back. Why the Broncos didn't just come out and in the first 2-3 drives just run the ball, but they didn't. So that's why they lost the game. And if you remember when Joe Flacco was starting, he threw the ball to his running backs a lot, and it's just not happening now. So I think Royce Freeman is definitely a sit until we see things change there. For the Bills, Devin Singletary with his second game this year with double-digit carries. The Bills won both games. What a coincidence. Singletary with between 4.5 to 5 yards per carry in both of those games. He did have 2 fumbles last week. Neither of them were lost, but hopefully that doesn't deter the coaching staff from staying with him because he looked great. So Singletary had a 74% snap count to Frank Gore's 24%. That's a 3-to-1 ratio. That should be what they continue to go to. Gore had 7 of his 11 carries in the second half, so hopefully the Bills will continue to use Gore as just a spell for Singletary and as a clock killer, and keep Singletary in as the ever down back. This has become one of the more potent rushing attacks with the quarterback there, Josh Allen, who now has 7 rushing touchdowns, and he's averaging only 33 rush yards a game. May not sound like a lot, but that extra 3.5 points a game, it just helps pad your floor there for sure. And I mean, 7 rushing touchdowns in 10 games is pretty good too. John Brown with his season high in targets, catches, and yards. Plus, he had 2 touchdowns last week versus the Dolphins. He's kind of one of these receivers that you can pencil him in for 1 or 2 of these huge games a year. The thing with him is that usually guys that are deep threats like that, aren't really. Oh, jeez, got my alarms going off here like crazy. Usually, deep threats like that aren't all that consistent, but John Brown has been consistent. The Broncos' pass defense is really good despite their second half meltdown last week. So I think John Brown's is really the only wide receiver for the Bills worth playing. You saw Cole Beasley; he had 4 targets, did okay. Isaiah McKenzie had 6 targets, he did okay. The one other guy with the Bills that I'm kind of excited about is actually Dawson Knox. I think he's a good play this week as well. He caught a short little seam route and broke a tackle for a touchdown. Nice little 20-yard touchdown run. He's shown some serious talent throughout the year in spurts. He's made a couple really nice catches. We saw this Broncos defense allow the Vikings tight end combo of Kyle Rudolph and Herb Smith catch all 8 of the tight end targets for 87 yards and 2 touchdowns last week. So maybe the Vikings kind of laid out a little floor plan for how to attack the Broncos defense with your tight ends. Might be a hole in the Broncos defense that Knox can kind of exploit. So he's another tight end this week that I think is a decent dart throw at least, and especially in FanDuel, one of those cheap tight ends that you can throw in your roster and help pad your roster with some more of the studs. All right, we got the Raiders at the Jets. So the Raiders -3 on the road, 46.5 point over under, I should say. And I kind of like this over in this game. It's 2 really bad defenses, 2 offenses that have been playing really well for the past couple weeks. Josh Jacobs with another 100-plus total yard game. That's his 7th of the year. He did have his first fumble, but John Gruden still gave him 20 touches after the fumble, so that's a really good sign. Usually coaches like to kind of limit rookies after a fumble, but not this dude. He's got a tough matchup versus the Jets, who actually allow the 9th fewest fantasy points to running backs, so this will definitely be a fun matchup to watch. The Raiders wide receivers have the best matchup in this game, however, with the Jets giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers. So Tyrell Williams, who hasn't scored since Week 8 after 5 straight games to start the season with a touchdown, and Hunter Renfrow, who has averaged 11.5 fantasy points a game since Week 8 now. They're both solid plays against this Jets defense. Like I said, they are good against running backs, but they're not very good against anything else. I am starting to get a little worried about Darren Waller. He averaged 8 targets a game through the first 6 games, but has only seen 3 targets a game over the last 4. So his usage has definitely gone down. Meanwhile, teammate Foster Moreau has caught 2 touchdowns over those 4 games, and now has 1 more touchdown on the season than Waller does. Plus, the Jets are actually pretty decent against tight ends. I spoke too soon. They allow the 7th fewest catches to the position, the 5th fewest yards. They've only given up 2 touchdowns to tight ends, and they give up the 4th fewest fantasy points overall to the position. So yeah, maybe it really is only the quarterback and the wide receivers that have the good matchup here for the Raiders. But looking at the Jets, after struggling against Miami in Week 9, Sam Darnold has put up back-to-back 20-plus fantasy point games. And he should have another good game here against the Raiders, who rank 7th in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. The entire pass game has good matchups this week, as the Raiders allow the 7th most fantasy points to wide receivers and the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends. So Jamison Crowder, he's become kind of a borderline must-start wide receiver 2 flex play in PPR leagues, with an average of 8 targets and 80 receiving yards and a touchdown in each of the last 3 games. Another solid tight end streamer, it's kind of the theme this week, is Ryan Griffin, who's had at least 4 catches and 50 yards in 3 of his last 4 games. And he has 3 touchdowns in those 4 games as well. So he's been involved. He led the Jets in receiving yards, and he actually led all tight ends in receiving yards last week with 109. So he's been playing well, man. You can't ignore it. All right, moving on to the Dolphins at the Browns. Dolphins plus 11, 44.5 point over-under in this game. The Dolphins away team over-under is 16.5, another one that I'm interested in there. Looking at the Dolphins, so Devontae Parker, he now leads the team in targets, catches, receiving yards, and air yards, yards after the catch, touchdowns, and obviously, most importantly to us, fantasy points. He's averaged over 12 fantasy points a game since their Week 5 bye. He had his season high in catches with 7 and receiving yards, 135 last week. His first 100-plus yard game this year versus a really tough Bills defense, at least pass defense. It was also only his 5th 100-plus receiving yard game of his 5-year career, which is kind of wild. A lot of people have been kind of waiting for this dude to become the number 1 wide receiver that he was drafted to be in the first round of the 2015 NFL draft. I'm not going to sit here and say that he's there, that he's turned that page, but he has shown some consistency over the past 7 games now. He also now has either tied for or flat out led his team in targets in half of their games. So he's become an important part of this offense. So maybe another one of these cheap FanDuel plays that can help you pad your lineup with some studs. Kalen Ballage and Jakeem Grant had 10 carries between the two of them last week and only had 16 rushing yards. But they had 2 touchdowns between the two of them. Plus, Jakeem Grant had a kick return touchdown. The Dolphins ranked dead last with 60 rushing yards per game. They had 23 total rushing yards on 11 carries last week. So I hope none of you are relying on Dolphins running backs. In my 12-team full PPR league, one of my buddies is actually really hurting at running back. He had Jordan Howard and Marlon Mack, and Dalvin Cook, who's on a bye, and so he had picked up Kalen Ballage a couple weeks ago, and so he had him in his starting lineup, and so I offered him a deal for what was it? Man, can't believe I just did this morning. I traded him one of my running backs for it was Kareem Hunt for DJ Moore. In that league, I have Juju as he was one of my 3 wide receivers. I've pretty much been playing a wide receiver in my flex all season. Now with Juju hurt and him playing really inconsistently all year, I felt like I needed to add another wide receiver. I'd been kind of banking on A.J. Green all year. I had him on my bench all season, hoping that, come this time of year, he'd be able to give me a nice little added boost, but things did not work out for me. A couple weeks before Kareem Hunt was activated, I picked him up off the waiver wire, and I have Nick Chubb in that league. So I had both Browns running backs, and I traded Kareem Hunt away for DJ Moore, who's actually been killing it. So I'm pretty excited about that deal. But, I'm really hoping none of you guys are counting on Kalen Ballage, and if you are, there are better options for you out there on the waiver wire. So I'd say go out there and get them. Speaking of Kareem Hunt, 17 targets in his last 2 games in Cleveland. Hunt was targeted on 4 of the 16 third down plays last week, and he converted 3 of the 6 third down. 3 of those of the 6 third downs that they did convert were because of him. So I'm going to be watching to see if that continues. Like I said, I had both of them in a full PPR league, and so I traded one of them, and now I have 3 solid wide receivers. 2 straight games for OBJ with double-digit targets and under a 50% catch rate. Since Baker said publicly that they need to funnel targets to Odell Beckham Jr., it's now 4 straight games that Landry has outscored Odell Beckham. They're both solid starts this week versus the horrible Dolphins defense. And it's a particularly good start for Jarvis Landry because of one special thing.
Revenge.
Yes, and I know it's been a couple years since he's left the Dolphins, but it's the only opportunity I have this week to drop that drop, so I'm going to use it. Last week, Baker Mayfield had his first 20-plus fantasy point game this year. Felt bad. One of my buddies, shout out Alex, asked me, about Baker Mayfield. I had told him to drop him, and then, of course, he went out and had his first 20-plus fantasy point game. But it was pretty much because he had that rushing touchdown in the first quarter that Odell caught that deep pass, and he was down at the 1-yard line, and instead of giving it to Nick Chubb, Baker took it in himself. Despite having his 5th game this year with a completion percentage under 63%, which was his completion percentage last year, which is really surprising to me considering his accuracy in college was probably one of the main reasons that he was drafted first overall. But Baker does have a good matchup this week, against this really bad Dolphins defense. So we'll have to see what happens there. Maybe maybe Baker can get on a roll here. I feel like the Browns finally know what this offense is. It's going to go through Odell and Jarvis on the outside, and it's going to be Chubb and Hunt on the inside. And hopefully they can get Njoku back because that's only going to help open things up even more for everybody involved on that team. All right, last AFC home game of the week here. We got the Cowboys going up to play the Patriots. Cowboys plus 6.5. It's a 46-point over-under right now. Zeke Elliott with back-to-back games with under 75 total yards. Made sense in Week 10 when he played the really good Vikings run defense, but last week versus the Lions, who still allow the most fantasy points to running backs, for him to struggle like that is definitely concerning. Zeke was bailed out because he had his first multi-TD game of the season, one on the ground, one in the air. Luckily for the Cowboys, they didn't really need Zeke or Amari Cooper, really, with Dak going off for over 400 passing yards for the 3rd time this season. He was 3 yards shy of hitting that mark for a 4th time in Week 10 as well. The number 2 and 3 wide receivers for Dallas had great games last week with 13 catches on 20 targets for 260 yards and a touchdown. Michael Gallup and Randall Cobb. The Cowboys are definitely going to need both of these guys to really step up and continue the streak of back-to-back games that both guys are on with double-digit fantasy points versus this Pats defense that allows the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. They've been awesome all season. Looking at the Patriots here, the Dallas defense has been pretty good this year, especially their pass defense. They allow the 8th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks and the 5th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. But the Pats offense looked old and slow to me last week against the pretty bad Eagles secondary. What do we got here? Jeez, I just lost my spot. How can you lose your spot? Julian Edelman with a rare 50% catch rate on 10 targets. who hasn't had a catch rate that low on a double-digit target game since Week 14 of 2016. He actually threw the only touchdown pass for the Patriots in the game last week. Another huge disappointing game actually for Mohamed Sanu after a 14-target day in Week 9. I thought the Pats would come out of their bye and kind of light up the Eagles, which did not happen. He saw only 4 targets last week, and he only had 1 yard per target, so that's not good. Two things the Cowboys struggle with is defending running backs in the passing game and defending tight ends, which is kind of surprising considering how good their linebackers are, but that's what the numbers say. I would say it should be a good game for James White, but he has not really been involved as much this year as he was last year. In 2018, he had a 22% target share. This year, he's only got a 17% target share. You would figure with the merry-go-round that has been the Patriots wide receiver group, you'd think that James White would be even more valuable than he was last year, but it just hasn't been the case. Last week, he only saw half of the running back targets, which never happened last year, versus the Eagles, who actually also struggle against defending pass-catching running backs. So very surprising to me that that James White is just not as involved as he has been. Maybe this week the Patriots change that. So, and this is going to be the first of a 3-game stretch for this Patriots defense that it should be real tests for them. We'll see after these 3 next games against Dallas, Houston, and then Kansas City how good the Patriots defense really is after they've been pretty much dominating teams all season, but bad teams. So that's going to do it for part 1 of the Week 12 Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you tune in later this week for the NFC home games. We got 7 NFC home games. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. For more episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Beers and Bruisers is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach TV, or your favorite podcast service. Beers and Bruisers is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com or download the free HC Universal Network app today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gaming operates a national problem gambling helpline network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Beers and Bruisers Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to drink responsibly and always look for your man downfield.